Today was round 6 in the Biel Grandmaster tournament, and it's the 6th game in a row without a rest day for the players, and tiredness seemed to be setting in. Peter Svidler blundered horribly against Maxime Vachier-Lagrave and lost. Shahriar Mamedyarov defeated Nico Georgiadis, but neither player played particularly accurately. Then we had a very interesting encounter between David Navara and Magnus Carlsen, which we're going to look at right now. You might recall that in the very first round of the tournament, Carlsen defeated Navara, so this is their second game, the return match. And in this position, Carlsen thought for about 4 minutes. So clearly he wasn't really anticipating this opening, or well, he still hadn't made up his mind. So previously we've seen him play the Ragozin. He's also played Queen's Gambit declined. He's played Knight d7, which leads to some Queen's Gambit variations often. And he's played that against Navara previously. We've seen him play the Slav. In fact, we've also seen him play even a6 in this position in some rapid games. Not such a silly move. That's a favourite of Rubinstein a long time ago. But today he played c5, the semi-Tarrasch. And he played this, well, fairly trendy line. Now, White can play e3 here, but the principal move, of course, is to claim the centre. And this centre is rather wonderful. The only reason that Black can get away with this, giving White this beautiful pawn front, is because Black manages to exchange some minor pieces. And that means that the pressure is somewhat relieved on Black's position. Now you might recall that in the Berlin Candidates tournament, Bishop c4 was played in a couple of crucial games. Mamedyarov against Ding was a very important game. Mamedyarov was defeated, and that went roughly like this. And this method of development, putting the bishop on b7 and knight d7, this is the modern way of playing the position and is very reliable. Navara played here instead of bishop c4, rook c1. It's one of the main moves. b6 from Carlsen, and bishop d3. Now, Black can play with bishop b7 and knight d7, but instead Carlsen went for a slightly unusual move, bishop a6. Now, he'd obviously prepared this, if not for this game, then at some other time. In some senses it makes sense, because the bishop on d3 is a very dangerous piece, potentially looking at h7. If you recall yesterday, where Vachier-Lagrave managed to set up a trick with queen b1, a double attack, attacking b6 and h7, always vulnerable. So exchanging off that bishop certainly is sensible. The only problem is that now the knight is sidelined, or, well, just not so great at the side of the board. Springer am Rand bringt Kummer und Schand. Castles from Navara. And now Queen e7 has been played before. It seems like a reasonable move, but Carlsen went for rook c8 fairly quickly, challenging on the c-file. And Navara, I think, selected a good option here. He played to control the c-file like this, and it's quite clear that White is better here, controlling this important file, and the centre has been maintained. Of course, the queen needs to defend the pawn on e4, and that knight on a6 certainly doesn't look great. So it's at this moment that Black actually has to defend really accurately, otherwise you could just fall into a very, very poor position, not to say lost. So h6 is possible here. I mean, that's a reasonable move because there are always going to be tricks on the back rank. But Carlsen played it after some thought. Obviously, a lot of calculation went in for this into this move. He played knight b4, which is a very forcing move, attacking the queen. Now, if the queen goes too far down here, then the e4 pawn is en prise. So queen c4 attacks the knight. a5 defends the knight. a3, you want to push that knight back, and then potentially go in with queen c6. But Carlsen met that with b5, so this had to be very carefully calculated. Queen c7, that forces an exchange of queens as the knight is attacked. And now that knight is slightly oddly placed. If it goes back, then we could play, for example, rook a7 and win the pawn. So the knight has to go forward into the heart of white's position. Now, it's not possible to trap that knight, but black has to be rather careful. It can still hop out, for example, to f4. So if, let's say, rook c3, knight f4, threatening a fork, they're very tricky, those knights, and now f5 generates counterplay because the d5 square is going to be available for the knight. So Navara played g3, covering the f4 square, and at the same time, very importantly, giving his king an escape square so there's no back rank tricks. And at this moment, Magnus Carlsen invested about 17.5 minutes on his next move, and he was absolutely right to put in the time because there are so many alternatives here, and if you get it slightly wrong, black can just have a completely lost position. There's no doubt that white is better here. The rook is actively placed on the 7th rank and can perhaps look to switch here. There's also the d pawn to take care of, and sometimes this knight can fly into the position. So let me try and give an example of that. Well, I mean, just in general, if the rook were to move away too quickly, then somewhere along there, then knight g5 could cause an accident on f7. Well, let's look at some alternatives. f5, what about this? Well, in this case, white has that beautiful rook on the 7th rank. The e6 pawn could be vulnerable. Doesn't look right. What about b4? Let's try this one. So we take, and if knight takes, then rook a7, and we're close to actually taking that pawn. Or if pawn takes, then we can bring the king over. And this is already rather uncomfortable for black. Let's try something else. What about knight b2 to try and spin around here? Well, in that case, the advance of the d pawn is very strong indeed. Remember that black still has a back rank problem, so that after, well, for example, knight d4, knight rook d8, then knight d4 is very strong indeed. So the pawn is immune. That's going to be checkmate. And otherwise, the knight is about to hop into the position on, well, one of these squares, and white just has an absolutely tremendous initiative. Looks too powerful. It's one interesting move which is somehow quite anti-positional, and that's f6. I think to give the rook even more power over the 7th rank is certainly risky, but it does shut out white's knight, that's one thing, and can sometimes give the king some room. So for example, if d5, then this can be taken, and in this case rook d8 is strong because there are no problems with the back rank, so actually this pawn is en prise. So what about rook c3? This gets tricky. And in fact, black can give a pawn up here and generates counterplay. That pawn's on prise. If it's defended, the rook has to keep defending that pawn. e4 is attacked, so that gets defended by the knight. And now knight b5. You can see that black has quite an initiative here. So the rook needs to defend both those pawns. And now rook c8 activates the rook. We'll come down here. Black has excellent compensation, probably sufficient compensation for the pawn, and should equalize. So f6 is very anti-positional. And in some ways I'm not surprised that Magnus didn't go for it, but actually it appears good. It's not his kind of move. He's far more pragmatic. He basically probably just rejected that on intuition. Instead, he played, after this long think, rook b8, and this is also actually fine for black and should equalize the position. Clearly, black would like to advance the b pawn. Rook c3 attacks the knight, and now knight e5, and this looks incredibly dangerous. But Magnus had calculated something. First, I thought that knight c4 was his idea. We were looking at this in the live commentary, and the idea is that black can reach a rook and pawn endgame. But it is quite risky because white's king travels across and can actually reach the c3 square, and once this rook activates, then that is certainly rather problematic. But Magnus had another think here, 9.5 minutes, he had to get the calculation right. f6 he played, which looks quite odd, pushing the knight into this fantastic position, and particularly as it seems to lose a pawn after this. And now obviously knight takes a3 can be met by rook takes a5. White is just a clear pawn up, but a4 instead. So knight a3 is threatened. Now it's the turn of the d pawn. So it's a very sharp position, this. Both white and black have a passed pawn. Which one is going to be the more effective? Well, black has just gained a tempo here by attacking the rook. Rook c5, and that rather dominates the knight. The knight only has one square. And in fact, knight b1 would be a losing move. And there's a very neat tactic. So the d pawn advances again. a2 looks a bit scary, but in fact white is winning with a very neat move. Perhaps you've spotted it. Knight e5. So if black gets a queen, then that will be checkmate because the knight has covered f7. And otherwise pawn takes and rook check, and white is going to get a queen and also stop this one. So it's typical of the calculation involved here, but you would have to spot that knight e5 in that variation is rather strong. So after rook c5, Magnus played king f7, bringing the king towards the d pawn, so that if d6, then king e6 is fine. So knight d4 from David Navara. The king comes across, and now you could say white has to be a little bit careful with this king coming across here. Rook c3, knight b1. So white has to take care that of this a pawn, but he can do that with a check. And after king d6, knight b5 check. Now this is quite a forced variation actually. You can play king e5, it leads to roughly the same thing, but Magnus just took on d5. Now rook c1, and this is where you have to calculate precisely. Well, you had to calculate precisely a long time before. Rook takes knight threatened. Also, knight c7 check threatened. So yeah, knight d2, knight c7 wins. Forking king and queen, king and rook. I beg your pardon. It's been a long day. So a3 from Carlsen. Now, if knight c7 check, king d6, and if the rook is taken, then a2, make a queen. White can still draw with knight b5 actually, but that's another story. But knight c7 doesn't work. Rook takes knight, a2. Now if rook a1, this actually loses because the king manages to protect the pawn and will win the rook, and that should be winning for black. So after a2, Navara just captured the a pawn and moved the rook to b7. So it's level material, but well, white has a symbolic advantage, you could say. King e4, absolutely necessary that the king returns to protect the kingside pawns. Threat king f3, so white shouldn't take on g7 yet. So king g2, g5 takes on h7, king f5. So basically with all the pawns on the same side, this is just a draw, very simple draw, 3 against 2. There are no serious winning chances here at all. And the players played out these last moves fairly quickly. This is actually a very simple one to defend. And here, in fact, Navara didn't even bother playing this one on. You could just play king g5 here and just protect that pawn, that's fine. You could also simplify here and play f4. g4, king g5 is fine for black. And this is a simple theoretical draw with double pawns, but okay. After h3, anyway, Navara offered a draw which Magnus accepted. It's interesting, I asked Magnus after the game at what point had he envisaged this final position, and that, you know, getting to this final position with the rook and pawn endgame. And basically he said at this point, move 24, when he played f6, he'd calculated that all out. So that's move 24, and we're at basically move 39 there. So that's, well, 15 moves, 15 half moves, so 30 moves in total he calculated basically. Very interesting. And I also asked him, well, I was surprised that he played this opening, because if we go back to this position, really here, I mean, this was pretty much forced from the way Magnus played. Only 2 results are possible. Either win for white or a draw, which is a most un-Magnus-like situation to be in. So I said, you know, why did you choose this opening? And he said he was really tired after playing such long games. He's been the latest one to finish in every round so far. And he said he wanted something simple and solid to play, so, you know, exchanging pieces basically. But he still had to put the work in to calculate the exact way to make a draw here. So yeah, it wasn't so easy for him. So after 6 rounds, Shahriar Mamedyarov actually leads the tournament. He leapfrogged Magnus. He has 4.5, and Magnus has 4. They're out in the lead. And now we have a rest day. So it's rest day is Saturday, and they resume play with round 7 on Sunday. So do join me for more videos, and don't forget to like, comment, subscribe and share. And if you want to support us on the PowerPlay channel, then do check out our Patreon page. We'd be most grateful for everyone's support. Thanks for watching.